Before we jump into a discussion of my learning theory of choice, I think it's good to get an overview of the three main theories of learning, or metaphors of learning, in the 20th century. As Mayer said in his 2019 article entitled 30 Years of Research on Online Learning, the science of learning is the scientific study of how people learn. Early in the 20th century, we had behaviorism, which was based upon rewarding desired behaviors. In effect, the behaviorist mechanism for teaching was the same for puppies, lion tamers, or humans. Encourage good behaviors through reward. Sometimes researchers even included punishment for bad behavior, which I assume was a bit more dangerous when working with lions. In fact, many of the theories and experiments were based upon work done with animals in lab environments. In the mid-20th century, a psychologist by the name of Jean Piaget published a paper that many say marked the beginnings of the next major theory of learning, Cognitivism. Up until then, most experts felt that learning was limited to a single item at a time, a single problem, a thread, or structure. Piaget proposed that a more complex process was at play. He proposed that development was the essential process, and each element of learning occurred as a function of total development. By this, he meant that we do not learn by rote repetition, but by development of knowledge within ourselves. There's much more to his article and to his theories, but this core concept that knowledge is developed through internalization of that which is presented to the learner, as opposed to repetition and reward, is the basis for the cognitive learning theory. Later, those who study learning would take cognitivism even further and would state that learning is strictly internal, requiring no outside prompting or teaching, needing at most a facilitator to provide guidance on a path of self-discovery. This theory of learning would be named constructivism, as the learner would construct their own knowledge through trial and error. For my e-learning course, I intend to concentrate on a cognitive approach. I believe this is the best option given the material that I intend to cover. I intend to teach my learners the process of using Zoom as a remote presentation tool. Not just the mechanics of the process, which would be more of a behaviorist approach, but also some of the tips and tricks to make it an effective communication medium. For my training to be effective, I'll have to incorporate some aspects that will seem behavioristic, walking through the steps of setting up a Zoom session and ensuring that it's functioning properly. But I'll also have to ensure that my students have absorbed enough of the underlying concepts to troubleshoot any issues quickly and under pressure. I mean, they will have an audience waiting for them after all. That will require that a good portion of my class be cognitive in nature. So with that said, let's take a look at what cognitivism is all about. So what is cognitivism? At its simplest, the cognitivist theory of learning concentrates on the process involved in learning as opposed to learning through observed behavior or repetitive action. Right? So one more time, it concentrates on the process involved in learning as opposed to learning through observed or repetitive behavior. From a classroom perspective, it's student-focused. So instead of concentrating on the act of teaching, it's focused on the act of learning. This swap of perspective requires that instructional designers and teachers understand the learning process and how information is received, processed, stored, and retrieved within the human brain. So let's start with how information is processed within the human brain. This graphic describes the cognitive load theory. So I like to think of information as a stream of water being fed into my brain. We've all heard the expression, like drinking water from a fire hose. We use that to describe a class that's either too advanced or too fast-paced or just too crammed full of information. Well, that's really the perfect description of the cognitive load theory. Your mind can only accept so much information at a time. It has an acceptable pace, if you will. We can accept information from two sources, auditory and visual, two hoses to maintain our metaphor. These two sources of information funnel into the brain. If the pressure from one or the other is too high, it can cause problems. Or if the combined pressure is too high, it can cause problems. Or if the total amount is too high, it overflows the funnel and information is lost. I mean, as you can see, the balancing act between auditory and visual information is a critical piece of creating an effective piece of instructional material. Beyond that, once the information has been received, it's placed in an area known as working memory. Now, working memory is a temporary holding cell where our current thought process can review and manipulate information in detail. It has the advantage of easy and fast access, but the disadvantage of limited space. It can only hold 3 to 5 items at a time. Anything more either can't be held or it pushes something out. Once information is no longer needed in working memory, it's moved into long-term memory, where it's categorized, organized, and connections are made to other memories and knowledge. Those connections are used to create schemata or schemas, which are combinations of knowledge which can be moved into working memory later as a single item. And that allows us to conceive of more complex thought processes, which helps with the limited capacity of working memory. That process of moving things into long-term memory and tying old knowledge to new is central to the cognitive load, or to the cognitive theory of learning. All of this really has just been a background to the cognitivist theory of learning. Remember, the cognitivist is concerned with how the learner processes that information coming in, how they make the connections, and how those connections are stored for later retrieval. If we were to look at the 3 main learning theories, behaviorism, cognitivism, and constructivism, cognitives would fall somewhere in the middle. They still believe that instruction is part of the learning process, but they believe that the instruction should lead students down a path in which they tie new information to old. They make connections on their own. They investigate new possibilities based upon those connections and take time to reflect upon how the knowledge will affect their own lives. If we see teaching as a spectrum along the line from behaviorism to constructivism, then I see cognitivism as tipping one way or the other depending upon the topic and the weight placed upon lecture versus discovery in the classroom. Cognitive learning relies upon tying new knowledge to old. For that, you have to have a good understanding of your students. Now, any instructional design model starts with a step that involves learner analysis. When you perform that step, dig deep. Find out what they've been exposed to, what they've experienced, what classes they might have taken, what level of knowledge you can expect. All of that is going to help you create an environment that can utilize that mechanism in the brain to make cognitive connections. Now, there will be some differences in how you support a cognitivist approach in a traditional classroom as opposed to an e-learning environment. Some things, however, will be the same across both those boundaries. For instance, in either case, you will need to know your students. You need to create materials and activities that are level set, appropriate to their experience with the topic. Now, for younger learners, this might mean age or developmental levels. For adult learners, it might be impacted by their work experience with the topic. There's nothing worse than sitting in a class where you know half of what is being presented, as evidenced by Mr. Greenshirt here. Remember that drinking from a fire hose statement? Same thing. You'll want to avoid, whether it's classroom or e-learning environment, avoid cognitive overload through chunking of content and organizing your information effectively. Some things will actually be more difficult in an e-learning environment. For instance, learning through inquiry. I mean, this is straightforward in a classroom environment. Students ask their instructor, they ask each other, they do collaborative research, and they have close to immediate feedback to their questions. In an e-learning course, however, this becomes more of a challenge logistically. I think this is best done through research projects that can then be graded by the instructor or reviewed by their peers. Speaking of peers, peer learning is another area that could be a challenge. Again, easy enough to accomplish in a traditional classroom. Divide the students into groups, give them a task or a topic, and you're well on your way. It's much more difficult in an e-learning environment. Take our class, for instance. While we have a discussion board, which is supposed to foster the impression of a community, there's no real give or take, and certainly no real communication amongst the students involved. Unless one is willing to look into the sources cited by your peers and give true comments, most of the discussions are nothing more than comments intended to make a grade. I think that peer learning in an e-learning course needs to have an element of anonymity, require both positive and a constructive criticism in the discourse to encourage true analysis, and be moderated by the instructor to ensure that the comments don't get out of hand. By that I mean hurtful. Some things might actually be easier in an e-learner format. Individualized content, for instance. There are many theories that discuss the various types of learners, the best way to address each type, and the tools available to do so. In a traditional classroom, certain types of learners might be left behind, either because of lack of resources. Maybe you don't have a budget, or the instructor doesn't have that type of skill set. Not everyone can be attuned to the bodily kinesthetic learner. In an e-learning environment, as long as you have the time and budget and imagination, you can add content for every type of learner that exists. Cognitivism is also very learner-centric. Anything that you can do to give control over the learning process to the student is considered a positive. In a traditional classroom, it can often be difficult to allow students to control which portion of a course they want to experience at any given point in time. The entire class often needs to move along the materials in sync. In an e-learning course, however, it's easy to provide a menu that gives control, or at least the illusion of control, over timing and content to the learner. A good menu system can ensure that students have choice where possible, but still enforce order where dependencies exist within the content. In summary, the cognitive learning theory focuses on what is happening within the human brain to maximize the effect of the learning process. Understanding these mental activities allows us as instructional designers and teachers to put together learning experiences that are effective for our students. To do this, we need to ensure that we understand our students so that we create materials and activities that are appropriate. We need to organize and chunk information to avoid cognitive overload. We need to encourage learning through inquiry, as this encourages reflection and the development of schemata. We need to develop opportunities for peer learning. And we need to develop content that is geared toward individualized methods of learning. I hope you enjoyed my overview of the cognitive learning theory.